Do you know that in 1488, the Portuguese became the first Europeans to step into Africa at the mouth of the Congo River? Using Christianity as a deceitful weapon, they converted and controlled the Congolese people by baptizing King Nzinga Kuwu in 1492 and renaming him Joao I. They set a precedent of replacing African identities with Portuguese ones. This paved the way for widespread enslavement and the spread of Christianity across Africa. The Portuguese exploited divisions among African communities, supplying weapons to stronger groups to fight and enslave weaker ones, facilitating mass enslavement and exportation. Black Stories Untold reveals the deep-seated atrocities committed during this period, showing how external forces manipulated internal conflicts. Join us as we uncover the devastating consequences of colonialism and the systematic dismantling of African civilizations. Before the 16th century, most Africans had never seen a white person. In many African societies, devils and evil spirits were believed to be white, so rituals to ward them off involved dances painted with white chalk. When Africans first encountered white people, they thought they were seeing living devils and would sometimes try to rub off what they believed was paint. Over 1,000 years had passed since various groups like the Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs and Turks had taken over Egypt. Arabs ruled eastern Sudan, and Arab-Hebrew rule was strong in isolated Abyssinia. On the east coast, Arabs from Zanzibar led slave-hunting operations through their Afro-Arab agents. Ghana and Mali had disappeared, and now Songhai was fighting its last battles against armies from the desert. Even in these conflicts, ordinary Africans rarely saw white people, including those who fled or stayed in their villages when enemy troops approached. Now, things were changing quickly. People realized they were being surrounded. Arabs were spreading into black territories, increasing tensions and tribal wars, weakening African states and destroying their independence. Discussing these issues highlights both internal and external challenges faced by Africans. However, Africans often avoid talking about these internal problems, which weakens their position against white power. The Portuguese were the first white Europeans to arrive in West and Central Africa. They quickly adopted the Arab strategy of dividing the blacks against themselves, a strategy since adopted by all white people. The Portuguese arrived at the mouth of the Great Congo River in West Africa in 1488. Their aim was to turn their small European state into a vast African Indian empire. They had two visionary leaders, Joao I and his son, Henry. Africa had been safe from invasions from the West because people believed the earth was flat. This belief was shattered in 1434, when Gil Annes sailed beyond where the Atlantic Ocean was thought to end and rounded Cape Bojador. From then on, the people of West Africa had to face the white devils from Europe and the Americas. The Portuguese, as ignorant of the African people as they had been about the shape of the earth, were not prepared to find highly advanced states there. The Kingdom of the Congo was their first great surprise, because its political structure and well-organized administration equaled that of Portugal or any other European state they knew. The Congo's economic system of agriculture and handicrafts, organized into guilds, was similar to other African states. Apprenticeship training for skilled occupations and the general pattern of social organization were also the same as other African societies. The Congo Kingdom was prosperous, engaging in external trade by land and rivers with states to the north, east, and west. The states to the south, later known as Angola, were uneasy due to the increasing presence of foreigners on the coast, nearby islands, and now sailing up the rivers towards the interior. Migrations from the Angola states increased, even though the Portuguese initially bypassed the region in favor of the more advanced Kingdom of Congo. The flight of potential slaves from the coastal areas may have caused the Portuguese to move closer to population centers, but it was more likely a strategic move. By establishing a stronghold in the Congo Kingdom, Portugal positioned itself to take over the entire region, with Angola caught between Portuguese armed forces on the northern border and those on the seacoast and offshore islands. In short, Portugal was positioning itself to dominate the black states in this region. Many historians and apologists for Portuguese imperialism in Africa use the Congo Kingdom as a prime example of Portugal's policy of racial equality. They argue that the Portuguese treated the Congo leaders as equals, with the King of Portugal addressing the King of Congo as brother. The Portuguese captains encountered Congo leaders who were not only their equals, but eager to advance their nation with any new and better offerings from the white world. These leaders took the Westerners at their word, believing the Portuguese claims that their king was the greatest and that their civilization was the pinnacle of progress under a universal religion led by a supreme pontiff appointed by the Son of God. The King of Congo and his people were promised not only welcome into the Christian fold, but also missionaries and teachers to help make their kingdom the greatest in Africa. Portuguese records indicate that material benefits, such as great wealth from trade, were also offered. The Kingdom of Congo serves as a case study of the westernization of the first group of blacks on the African continent. However, this westernization was only a means to a much greater end. Portugal's real objective was not to bring Christianity and a higher civilization to Africa. Instead, Christian civilization served as the charm words in the white man's magic, convincing both the Africans and the Europeans themselves that they were introducing a better life. The Europeans believed that even the enslaved people were better off under their standard of civilization, and thus they were serving God in Africa. Christian missionaries were seen as the most effective servants of empire. The court at Lisbon had ambitious plans. Despite being a small state, Portugal aimed to build an empire across Africa from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean, which would also serve as a connection to the projected Indian Empire. This grand design was Portugal's ultimate goal, and the Congo Kingdom was merely a stepping stone and base of operations. Portugal realized that a permanent empire, built with the sweat and blood of another people, would be more successful if the minds of the people could be captured first. They knew not to start with guns blazing, except in cases where the natives were too smart and saw through their schemes. In such cases, they justified using force for the natives' own salvation. The main strategy was to change the blacks into the white man's image, causing them to reject and become ashamed of their culture and themselves. This process began in the Kingdom of Congo, making it essential to closely examine how westernization took root there. The missionaries began their work on kings and notable figures, which was a common strategy. The Congolese were eager for the new education and Christianity, making the priests' tasks easier. To become a Christian, one had to be baptized and take a Christian name, which were Western names used in the conquering country. The first Congolese king to become a Christian was Nzinga Kuwu in 1492, who took the Portuguese name Joao I. Hundreds of others followed his example, including princes, chiefs, ministers, and some common people. Notable Congolese kings who adopted Portuguese names included Afonsos, Alvarez, Dom Pedros, and Diogos. Overbearing Jesuit fathers were installed as counselors to the king, with one acting as prime minister. This move destroyed the traditional council that controlled chiefs and kings, making it easier for European powers to operate. The age of absolutism with the rise of the nation-state in Europe, was reflected in the Congo Kingdom. With the Portuguese creating a wedge between the king and the people, Congo rulers could make important decisions without consulting black councillors. They tended to become absolute monarchs regarding their people, but generally remained puppets of the Europeans. Exceptions included Afonso I and Diogo I. The idea of divine kingship was promoted through the anointment and crowning of kings by Portuguese bishops, who ruled as sons of the church, chosen by divine decree to serve it. This meant serving the Portuguese by meeting their demands, which were always presented as friendly suggestions from equals in Christ. Even the traditional political system was made to appear as a Portuguese creation. Before any Europeans arrived, the Congo Kingdom was already highly organized, with each village and town under a chief, called Mani, each district under a Mani, and each of the 6 major provinces under a governor, also called Mani. Now, in addition to widespread use of Portuguese names, important Portuguese titles appeared, such as dukes and infante, a new class of princes, which had never been used in Africa before because the Western conception of royalty was absent. This transformation under external influence played a decisive role in destroying the best in African civilization while publicizing all elements of barbarism that could be found. The new masters of the continent, with their all-powerful position, could impose their viewpoints on the world. The system of reducing blacks to non-persons was so thorough that not only did other people of the world regard them as such, but, tragically, the blacks themselves began to feel inferior and hate themselves and their kind. This transformation was akin to magic, since these whites, who called themselves Portuguese, had arrived. As the 15th century moved toward the 19th, Europeans transformed from white devils into white masters, supported by powerful weaponry. White ceased to symbolize evil in the black world, and instead, black became associated with evil, bad luck, and negativity. To make a white man appear evil, he had to be dressed in black. Death, the ultimate tragedy, required mourning in black, while joyous occasions like baptisms and weddings called for wearing white. God, being depicted as white, was believed to have cursed blacks to be the servants of man, with man being the white man created in God's image. Thus, worshipping God became synonymous with worshipping the white man. These psychological tricks, now ingrained in cultural thought, have been more effective in subjugating blacks and reducing them to an inferior status than military force. Caucasian victory was complete and seemingly permanent when blacks worldwide joined whites in glorifying all things white and condemning all things black, including themselves. This self-abnegation, self-effacement, and loss of self-identity by severing ties with their past have weakened their ability to draw strength and inspiration from their history. This is at the core of the race problem. In attempting to replace their own values with those of the white man, black people lost their personality and manhood almost entirely. Nearly 500 years have passed since the first Europeans landed on the West African coasts, beginning the transformation of blacks from men to half-men. Despite this long history, countless blacks remain frustrated by the perpetual struggle to see life through the blue eyes of Caucasians. The status of African people worldwide remains too precarious to address their history by simply chronicling events. It is crucial to understand the meaning of these events, their impact on the people, and the overall changes in historical direction to determine what new paths the race must take. The Portuguese aimed not just to conquer blacks, but primarily to destroy Arab power in Africa and Islamic control of the overland trade routes to the east. This goal motivated Columbus's voyages and other European explorations. The Portuguese used religion as their spearhead, remembering that Christian states existed in Africa since ancient times. One such state, which had escaped Muslim destruction, was located in what had been a southeastern border state of the ancient Ethiopian Empire, identified by the Portuguese as a kingdom ruled by King Prester John. The idea was to unite the Christian forces of Europe with those of Africa in an all-out war against the Arabs. What was not generally known was that the kingdom of Aksum, which expanded into the Empire of Abyssinia, was alternately ruled by Christian Arabs and colored Christian Hebrews. Not all Arabs were Muslims, and not all Hebrews were religious Jews. African Hebrew and Christian Arab communities existed in southern Arabia and Yemen, close to the East African country they later conquered. However, the Portuguese did not reach this African Christian kingdom in time to use it in their campaign against Islam. Instead, they began creating a black Christian kingdom in their own image, which was Congo. By 1512, the Portuguese plans were clear. King Manuel of Portugal outlined these plans in a document called the Regimento. This document is significant in the history of black people because it was the first detailed blueprint for the conquest of the black man's mind through acculturation via Christianity, body through slavery, and country. Despite its endearing words of equality and brotherly love, historians have noted that the Portuguese policy towards Africa was one of supposed equality and humanitarianism. However, the Congolese king Afonso saw through this plan and attempted to resist, though it was too late. Manuel imposed a heavy tribute on Afonso, demanding slaves, ivory and copper to cover the costs of his Christian civilization program, various expeditions, and the education of a few Congolese children in Portugal, including the king's son. Manuel then ensured that his Code de Congo was implemented by sending Simão de Silva as both ambassador and, effectively, governor-general or viceroy of Congo. Simão de Silva's functions, though covered by the courtesy title of advisor to the king, included co-administering the nation, acting as a supreme judge, and controlling the army and finances. He was to conduct a comprehensive geographical survey of the country to determine its natural wealth for direct exploitation. However, things quickly spiraled out of control. The Portuguese settler population, primarily based on the coast and offshore islands, sought the quicker riches that would come from the increasing demand for black slaves. These settlers pursued a more aggressive course of action, ignoring the Lisbon court's diplomatic language and covering up their real operations. Up to the 16th century, the people we now call slaves were not slaves in the modern sense, but laborers captured as prisoners of war or imprisoned for various offenses. During the early stages of the slave trade, many African chiefs and kings thought they were providing needed workers and profiting greatly. They were not familiar with the white man's slave system or its racial aspects. However, as time passed, many Africans, like those in the Congo state, became deeply involved in the horrors of the trade, knew what they were doing, and became as brutal as the whites in their pursuit of guns and riches. African leaders saw guns not just as weapons of death, but as the source of the white man's power and an immediate threat to their own existence. The cannons brought into Africa seemed to signal the potential destruction or total enslavement of their race. Africans became insistent on acquiring guns in trade. There was a silent embargo on arms to Black Africa, a sort of white gentleman's agreement. Chiefs' demands for guns clashed with Europeans' and Arabs' demands for slaves. Chiefs could hinder the trade if their demands for guns were not met. Some traders realized that giving firearms to certain strategically located kingdoms would double and triple the supply of slaves, as these kingdoms would expand over weaker states, capturing millions of prisoners to be enslaved. Aggressive traders saw arming these states as a risk worth taking in pursuit of wealth. The imperialist-minded saw an even greater outcome: perpetual warfare among blacks, creating lasting hatred between groups, destroying unity, and keeping them so busy fighting each other that they would forget their real enemies, the white devils from the sea. The Portuguese Christianization of the Congo created chaos. Priests were not only among the leading slave traders, but also owned slave ships to transport the black cargoes to distant lands. They kept harems of black girls, euphemistically called house servants. Most whites involved were the scum of their own lands, and even the half-educated priests were often of low moral character. The slave situation became increasingly desperate and uncontrollable, as every white man, down to the lowliest worker, became a trader. Builders sent to erect fortifications and other installations for the Portuguese were all slave traders. Sailors and unskilled laborers had their own quotas of slaves, especially slave girls. One main attraction that drew thousands of white men was their unlimited sexual freedom with enslaved black girls and women. These wholesale raids on black womanhood continued to swell the mulatto population, who, like in Egypt and the Sudan, often became the loyal servants and representatives of the conquering races to which their fathers belonged. The Congolese king, Afonso, found himself besieged on multiple fronts and hamstrung by the Portuguese advisor who had veto power over his actions. Despite this, Afonso was no weakling. He tried, albeit too late, to gain control of the slave trade, a necessity as competing raiders were enslaving every black they could capture, including members of the royal household and numerous title holders throughout the country. Meanwhile, the King of Portugal declared a royal monopoly over the trade, frustrating Afonso's efforts and clashing with the interests of the powerful and independent slave merchants who controlled the coasts and represented great chartered companies that dominated global commerce. Though they operated under royal charters and the court was a principal shareholder, the distance from Lisbon allowed them to bypass de Silva and other royal representatives, continuing their activities as they wished. The Jesuit missionaries, or war dogs of the Lord, were particularly helpful in forming slave-hunting alliances with interior chiefdoms in exchange for outdated guns. For those seeking specific details on how advancing black states were systematically destroyed across Africa, Angola, and the Kingdom of Congo, provide yet another example. The strategy for destruction rarely varied, supporting the concept of a grand Caucasian consensus on non-white peoples. White groups would spread across various provinces, laden with gifts of goodwill, and attach themselves to the courts of local chiefs as friendly advisors, promising to guarantee the chief's security, extend their power, and bring them great riches. The gift of a few old guns replacing spears often convinced chiefs that these whites were indeed saviors and friends. No matter how strong and effective the central government at San Salvador had been, it was undermined by well-planned European activities in the provinces, identical to those carried out in Egyptian provinces 3,000 years earlier in Cuba and repeated all over Africa. The goal was to provoke war among blacks, pitting gun-armed groups against those with only shields and spears, thus skyrocketing the number of captives for slavery from a few thousand to millions. Entire villages and provinces were depopulated, and formerly proud and free citizens were marched off in chains, collared, and joined by heavy poles. Many royal lineages, including chiefs, were among the captives, adhering to the African tradition that leaders and people shared the same fate. This sense of unity applied only to members of one's tribe, not to Africans outside it, a tragic fact of black history. Chiefs and kings would capture prisoners of war by attacking other states, as only a savage chieftain would sell his own people into slavery. Europeans quickly learned this and found it fit well with their plan to keep blacks divided, forever suspicious of each other. These mutual hatreds and suspicions were historically derived not from European actions, but from the blacks' own record of tribal warfare. As slave raids spread throughout Angola and Congo, many blacks fled overland and up the rivers toward the central and southern areas of the Great Savannah regions and lakes. Some, like those in Cuba, found security long enough to rebuild remarkable states, while others found refuge only in hidden recesses, succumbing to decay and decline. Meanwhile, the fierce Jaga warriors continued their rampage, fighting with or against any group, including white slave traders. The Portuguese were less hesitant to supply the Jaga with guns, as they generally waged war against other Africans. The widespread wars to capture slaves and the heavy traffic along slave trails to the coasts raise questions about the necessity of alliances with the Jaga, unless it was to compensate for the high death toll among captives. For every 2 million blacks enslaved, over 1 million died. Records indicate that many millions preferred death to slavery, while explicit statements of such facts are absent from Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish, English, or American documents. The archives in Lisbon overflow with African documents dating back 500 years. Through these records, historians often uncover unintended pictures and messages. You won't find accounts like this explicitly written. It is not true that all women, and even children, were marched in chains. This was unnecessary because we learned that these black women are so loyal to their men that they would follow them even into hell, capture their men, and you did not have to capture them. Yet many of these women sought death by attacking us and our armed guards. These, of course, were beaten and chained like male slaves. Another problem was the large number of suicides during the 200-mile trek to the slave pens on the coast. The greatest number died from poison, which hundreds of women concealed on their bodies, passing it to friends and kin at night before giving it to their children and taking it themselves. This slowed us down during the night when we should have moved faster because it was cooler. The dead and dying had to have their chains chopped off from the living. Many babies were deliberately smothered by their dying mothers. We do not believe that the other deaths were caused by the long march, as some allege. While it is true that we are carried in hammocks with bearers changing every 10 or 15 miles, the biggest and strongest boys, usually between 20 and 30 years old, are selected to carry us. They sometimes collapse, but only 5 have died this year. These blacks are used to walking long distances with heavy burdens. There are many problems in this business. The captains on the coast always complain about our slow movement and the many weeks the march takes. They do not account for the time lost stumbling over the skeletons and rotten bodies of slaves that went along these trails before us. The stench of recent deaths is unbearable, yet we bear it. We lose time finding routes free of the dead and dying. Many perfectly healthy blacks drop dead without apparent cause, some say out of sheer spite. We work in fear, as our guns are often useless against increasing ambush attacks along these trails. The real danger lies in the Angola region, with the Black Terror in the form of a death-defying black queen, King Nzinga. Who ever heard of a woman general leading her armies in person? She is the greatest military strategist ever to confront Portugal's armed forces. Her tactics keep our commanders sweating in confusion and dismay. Her aim is the total destruction of the slave trade. She has developed a system of infiltrating our black troops with her own men, causing whole companies to rebel, desert, and join her war of liberation. Portuguese casualties are always heavier than reported, for she stages surprise attacks with lightning speed, aiming first to capture guns and cannons. Even with armed guards on our long marches, we never know how many of our black soldiers are the Queen's own men. This would have been a true account up to 1663, when the 40 years of unremitting warfare Queen Nzinga waged against the Portuguese to free Angola ended with her passing. Africa lost her greatest daughter, and the slaves lost their greatest emancipator. Where is this explicitly written? Nowhere. It has been pointed out that Afonso was a statesman, not merely a puppet of the Portuguese. Despite his conversion to Christianity and adopting a Portuguese name, he realized the true intentions behind the Portuguese code and began to resist its provisions designed to turn Africans into black Portuguese while destroying their sovereignty. Although the enemy eventually prevailed, this does not diminish Afonso's stature as a great African leader. The pressures on him increased as Portuguese greed from the slave trade led them to seek gold, silver, copper, and lead they believed were hidden by the blacks. The African population also faced increasing pressures from widespread slave hunts and raids. Historians often highlight the role of African chiefs and kings in the slave trade, but rarely mention the general African opposition or the leaders who fought against it. Queen Nzinga was not the only abolitionist. She is just one who cannot be excluded from history due to her extensive involvement and treaty negotiations. The Congolese who opposed their kings fought against both slavery and the Christian church that promoted it. The education they desired turned out to be a farce, with schools functioning as Catholic catechism classes under corrupt and immoral priests. All of Afonso's efforts to establish a good school in Congo were blocked, as widespread education for blacks was not intended. Portugal itself lacked many educated men in the 16th century, with its masses as ignorant as those in the rest of Europe. The situation worsened when Diogo became King of Congo in 1545, supported by Lisbon court factions. Meanwhile, powerful traders based in Luanda and São Tomé expanded slave operations in defiance of the Congolese kings and the King of Portugal. They were aided by the King of Ndongo, although Ndongo was a tributary state of Congo. In 1556, open war broke out between the Royal Portuguese forces allied with Congo and Portuguese trader forces allied with Ndongo. In reality, it was a war of Africans against Africans, with the Portuguese safely in the rear. A royal decree from Lisbon explicitly stated that black troops should be used in dangerous situations to safeguard white lives, although this would have happened regardless. The Congolese were defeated, and Ndongo and the slave traders controlled the trade. Despite Lisbon's instigation and direction of the war, the victorious traders used Ndongo to negotiate a new alliance with Lisbon and lay the foundation for making Angola a Portuguese colony. Portuguese councillors to Diogo denied responsibility for the disaster, yet they were still involved in choosing his successor, promoting further turmoil in the disintegrating nation. The murder of one king after another became routine, and enemy attacks marked the declining years of Congo as a great power. The Jaga warriors nearly destroyed Congo in 1568. Things moved rapidly. In 1575, Angola became a colony of Portugal by royal decree, and Congo, struggling for survival, could only mourn the loss of her greatest offspring. Historians often simplify this period, making it seem like Congo's near collapse led to an immediate and easy takeover of Angola. However, the disintegration of Congo was not complete, and there was a revival under another line of great kings. Although the conquest of Angola began in 1575, the Portuguese faced a long and bloody war lasting nearly half a century. They had not anticipated the resistance led by Queen Nzinga, one of the bravest generals to ever command an army. The struggle for Africa's progress continues as modern forms of exploitation and division persist. The same forces that once used deceit and manipulation to enslave and control are now working against our unity and advancement in various ways. Economic manipulation, political interference, and cultural domination are just a few of the tactics being used to keep us divided and hinder our progress. These white devils still aim to weaken Africa by fostering internal conflicts, exploiting resources, and undermining our efforts to build a strong, united continent. Understanding our history is crucial in recognizing these ongoing challenges and finding strength in our shared heritage. We invite you to share where you are watching from and join the conversation. Let's unite in our quest for knowledge and empowerment. Subscribe to Black Stories Untold to uncover more hidden truths about our past and stay informed about the ongoing struggle for Africa's future. Together, we can resist and overcome these obstacles, forging a path toward true freedom and progress.